This is Hannibal here from the HannibalTV.com. This is my draft book, part 5. And before I get into part 5, as customary, there's not a lot to recap from part 4 that I remember. Part 4 was my introduction to pro wrestling and mat rats. Other than I wanted to say that to lead into part 5, I mentioned in part 4 that when I was 17, I had like a 27-year-old girlfriend who I had met in Calgary. And I'm not gonna go into too much detail on that whole situation, but basically nothing was going on in Calgary with mat rats anymore, and I couldn't afford to train at the dungeon. And the girl I was dating at that time had been living in a place where someone was filming her without her knowledge. So she was had to lawyer fees and stuff and had to move out of that place. So she ended up moving back with her parents. So I decided, okay, I'm gonna move back across the country. For anyone Americans listening to this, Calgary is like where Montana is. Ottawa, where I am, is closest major American city is Syracuse. So way across country. It's about a 4-day drive. Which, by the way, I did hit a moose on the way back to my my parents' house, but luckily it just broke off the side mirror and didn't actually cause me any harm. But anyway, so we decided we were gonna stay together just for continuality. We were gonna stay together. She was a bartender. She was gonna bartend, live with the parents, get the legal situation sorted out. I was gonna actually go to my parents, save some money, and train with Jacques Rougeau. So I'll get into part 5. How did I know I could train with Jacques Rougeau? At that time I think I was 16 years old. It was the summer before my senior year of high school. I had been going to Jacques Rougeau's shows after his last WWE run, which was very forgettable. He didn't even remember it because there was recently a podcast with Jacques Rougeau and Dan Severin that I had a collaboration agreement with to air some of the footage on my channel. We worked together with Dan Severin's Unleashed TV podcast. And they were actually in the Attitude Era together, but they didn't even remember ever meeting. But Jacques, he had a big retirement match, and I think it was 1994 in Montreal at the Montreal Forum, which was the last wrestling sellout at the Montreal Forum, legitimate sellout. He had wrestled his Quebecers partner, Pierre-Carl Ouellet, in a very well-built angle. Then he had claimed he was retiring. He went on to start his own promotion called International Wrestling 2000 in Quebec. From what I understand, he got in a bit over his head. He was trying to restart the Quebec territory, and there was just way too many shows at first. He had a wrestling school too. Uh, so he ended up not being able to fund it anymore, and he ended up going back to work for WCW, where he was the Amazing French Canadians. That run didn't work out too well, although he did famously beat Hulk Hogan during that run on the only WCW show in Montreal, which I attended. And to this day, of all the wrestling events I've attended, that match, Hulk Hogan against Jacques Rougeau, had the most heat of any. You could cut the electricity in the air with a knife that night because it was Hulk Hogan's first time returning to Montreal. And since his WWE days, it was in '96. There was more for I was also at Survivor Series '97 in Montreal for the infamous Montreal screw job. I can tell you 100% there was more heat when Jacques Rougeau beat Hulk Hogan. People were furious overall than there was during the screw job. Far, far, far more heat. It was almost a riot situation. Um, in the end, I know Quebec people are happy for the legacy of of having a Quebec person beat Hulk Hogan, and Hulk Hogan did that out of respect for the Rougeau family and the Rougeau name, and because he was so famous in Quebec. But that night, people missed Hulk Hogan so much that they were actually mad about it. And that was the one and only WCW show in Montreal. And I remember tickets were $100 to that for first and second row, which in those days, even WWE tickets, first and second row, were still $30 for house shows. So I remember that was like a crazy price for tickets back then, but I ended up getting second row seats right by the aisle for that. And the guardrails were actually bent. There was so much heat that the guardrails on my side were actually bent in half after Hogan and Rougeau came out, and there was garbage being thrown in the ring after Rougeau won. It was just crazy, crazy heat. It was surreal. So again, after that, he went to WWE. He was not used well in WWE. I think WWE, we all know Vince McMahon can be spiteful, and I think he was mad that Rougeau had done that retirement match and then come back and then gone to WCW. So I think they lost their debut at WWE when they returned as the Quebecers against Public Enemy, from what I recall. I think they did. And then it was a very forgettable run. Not many people even remember it. The only real Quebecer memorable thing from that run was PCO doing the brawl for all with Steve Williams. Um, and so then when that run ended, Jacques went back to promoting his Loot International 2000. But when he came back to promoting it, he wasn't doing like tours where there would be a ton of shows and he'd have to put a lot of money out. His events were still big. They were in like the Verdun Auditorium, the Pulse or the Pierre Charbonneau Center. In Montreal, those events, those arenas hold about 4 or 5 thousand fans, and they would sell out. And then he would do random other shows throughout Quebec. The only show I think he ever promoted in Ontario after his his return from WWE was randomly, and I never even asked him why he did this show there because it was so random. It was in a very small town called Alexandria, Ontario, which is, I mean, it's about an hour outside of both Ottawa and Montreal. It's about halfway in between Ottawa and Montreal, not too far away from Cornwall, Ontario. So a good location as far as centrally located. But the arena only held about 1,000, and I would say there's about 900 people there that night. And the main event was Jacques Rougeau against the Hands of Stone, rugged Ronnie Garvin. And at the Montreal shows that Jacques would do, because there was so many thousands fans, he never really signed autographs for whatever reason, which was strange because he could have made a lot of money. Even the WCW show in Montreal didn't have any merchandise. So I think, and I think Jacques actually promoted that show. So he never was actually the greatest at the merchandise end of it. Because I mean, imagine if they'd had NWO shirts at that WCW Montreal show, they would have sold out. But they didn't have any merchandise at all. Um, and there was 15,000 people in the arena. So I actually got to meet Jacques Rougeau that night because he was signing autographs at intermission, and I had heard he'd had a wrestling school. I was 16 years old at this time. And at this time, he was only, he ended up being known for training kids, but at this time, I told him I was interested in wrestling, and he signed his autograph to me, and he wrote on the back of the picture, that he signed the autograph to, his number and said, "Call me when you're 18. I'll train you how to wrestle." So I am 18 by this time. I think I called him in like January 2002. I turned 18 in October 2001. So I called him up and I said, "Are you still willing to train me?" I'd mentioned that I had done some training in Calgary, but I think I had the Mat Rats match and two or three Stampede wrestling matches where I just got my ass kicked because I had no idea how to wrestle. And but at that time, Stampede Wrestling was drawing like 50 people to the Ogden Legion in Calgary, and they were paying so little. Like people were sometimes getting paid in change for Stampede Wrestling. That's not an exaggeration, but they were paying so little that the veterans weren't really showing up at 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 the Stampede shows. So I remember showing up and being like, I'll wrestle for free if you let me wrestle somebody. And then they said at that time Calgary still had a boxing and wrestling commission. They said, sure, as long as you pay the wrestling license fee, which I think was $50 at the time, we'll let you wrestle. So I had a few matches, but again, I wasn't trained. I have like pretty much no training, so the veterans just basically beat me up, which I didn't know they were beating me up and roughing me up at the time. I just thought that was wrestling. So, anyways, very different. Calgary was like a shark atmosphere in a way for the veterans. Jacques Rougeau, he told me at this time they were only doing one training class a week. It was Saturdays. It was at the flea market, Marché de Puce Métropolitain in Montreal. So the ring was like at this indoor flea market, and people could watch the training. So there was nothing secret about the training, and he was only doing one one training session a week because he wasn't actually training people how to wrestle on the fly. He was doing at this point, I don't know, 3 or 4 shows a year, and he was just training his wrestlers how to do the match on the next show. So you would show up and you'd be put in some type of match on the next show, whenever it was, and you would just practice the same match over and over and over again every Saturday. And he would teach you how to bump and lock up and stuff, and random stuff, but you'd mostly be practicing the match that you would do. So again, there was nothing where the dungeon there was people with mean streaks and stuff in them, and even in Mat Rats, like it was more like competitive, I would say. Jacques Rougeau, by this time, he had allowed kids to start wrestling. So there was, I mean, his kids, Cedric and Jean-Jacques, were around who were, I think, maybe even under 10 at that time, or I think Cedric may have been maybe 12 or something. And I don't know, they were very, very young, I remember. They would be around, and there was kids anywhere from like 12 to 18. At this time, I was 18, and I was one of the oldest. I think there may have been someone that was like 22, but it was mostly kids wrestling, and he did very well with this. He got very big crowds. As unbelievable as it sounds, having mostly kids wrestlers, and at this time, the only like adults on the card were Jacques Rougeau and Carl Ouellet, and some of the older guys Jacques had trained in the 90s, and whoever he brought in to be the stars. For instance, the first event I did for him, he had brought in the Road Warriors to be the stars. So obviously they were men. The training, as I said, you didn't really learn how to put a match together on the fly, but he taught. Of course, Jacques was always known to be a great entertainer. I still think he has the greatest facial expressions ever in professional wrestling. very good at the facial expressions and how to be loud in the ring. So I think he helped with like character development and and the entertainment side of wrestling. But I didn't mind that the practices were only once a week because I was commuting the 2 hours from Ottawa, and sometimes if there was traffic, it'd be 2.5, 3 hours. So I didn't mind that the practices were only once a week just because of the cost of gas. The cost of the training, I think, was $2,000, which he let us pay in installments. So that wasn't bad. He did have a rule that you couldn't wrestle for anybody else, which people like Kevin Owens eventually really held big grudges for him. The reason why he didn't want people wrestling for anyone else is because he put on these shows in front of like 3,000, 4,000 people, and he felt that if you're wrestling in front of 50 people at an independent show, your name value would go down and it would make his shows seem less special. And he also didn't want people losing on indie shows. Strangely enough, almost all the time it would be almost all baby faces winning on his shows. He felt like the fans wanted baby faces to win all the time, because and it was mostly kids wrestling, so for whatever reason, he felt that the baby faces should almost, other than in rare circumstances, always go over. So anyways, the a couple of things to stand out from the training was, Carl Ouellet would show up, uh, to just train and get in shape sometime. That was always cool seeing him. Really enjoyed, training with him, and he was always a good friend to me. He actually helped me get my job in Puerto Rico in England. Very good guy, nothing but the highest respect for him. Jacques is very tough. I remember the day that he taught us chops. He didn't want us giving chops to any of ourselves. So he took all the chops from everybody, and keep in mind we did not know how to chop. So he was taking chops in the nipples, chops in the neck from everybody. And I think at this time there was like 12 to 15 people in the class. So for like half an hour straight, he took chops from everybody. And I just remember how red his chest was after. So I remember that was really impressive because he didn't even make a big deal about it. It's just like I don't want you kids hurting each other. So take it all out on me. I remember one funny thing about Jacques is sometimes he'd have to like take a crap or whatever, but he'd want to talk to me. So he's like, come to the bathroom, stand outside the stall. I'm going to talk to you while I'm taking a crap. That's kind of funny, but that's just the kind of character he is. As far as Kevin Owens, I've heard him say in a RF Video Shoot interview that Jacques never trained anyone and he was doing all the training at the schools, and he was claiming that he actually trained me. Well, I think Jacques may have told Kevin to maybe show me a few things here or there, because Kevin, he wasn't by this point, he started training when he was 14, so by the time I started training with Jacques, Kevin was only there to practice his match for whatever show was coming up, which would usually be done after, like, the novice training, which I was in the novice training. So other than him watching us, my contact with him was actually very little. I never had any issues with him at those training sessions, um, because I would basically just come in and shake his hand. He was quiet at that time. I was very quiet and shy in those days, so, like, our communication was little to nothing. Um, I'll go into to saying where my issue with him came up later, but Kevin had been wrestling with Jacques a long time, and again, he eventually left Jacques because he had issues with not being able to wrestle anywhere else. And by that time, Kevin was becoming uh, a good wrestler, and he wanted to expand, but he ended up taking it more personally. than others. I understood why Jacques didn't want people to wrestle for anyone else. Um, so as far as Jacques goes, that's pretty much it. I did train with Jacques for about a year or so, a little less than a year. Then I did go back to Calgary, which I'll go into the Stampede Wrestling part in part 6. And then I didn't really talk to Jacques at all after I went to Calgary until um, I did a shoot interview with him in, I think it was 2014, and it was before I even had a YouTube channel. It was at a time that I was originally planning to do shoot interviews for DVDs. So he was one of the first shoot interviews I ever did. It was Jacques, Billy Graham, and Honky Tonk Man, like the first 3 shoot interviews I ever did, and they were originally supposed to be for DVD, but it never came out on DVD, and it ended up some of the clips of it on YouTube have hundreds of thousands, and it was done at Chez Monique barbershop, a famous barbershop in Montreal, where I think it was actually in 2013 because I was under hepatitis C treatment at that time. It was in the winter of 2013. It was very cold, and it was at a famous barbershop where like the Montreal Canadiens get their hair cut, the Montreal Alouettes. Andre the Giant had his haircut there. Jacques would take famous wrestlers there. I think Hulk Hogan even had his haircut there. Very famous barbershop in Montreal, and they did a good job of cutting my hair. And I think it's the record for the longest haircut of in the world because Jacques was getting his haircut almost the whole interview, which is funny because he doesn't have a full head of hair anymore. But anyways, when I did that interview with him, we ended up kind of reuniting because I hadn't talked to him for like 10 years at that point, really, other than checking in here and there. Um, so what happened was I told him that I was undergoing Hep C treatment. I was retired during this point because I was sick. I was going through treatments and I still had Hep C. So I talked to him about maybe when I return when if this treatment works and I get cured, maybe I could start wrestling for you again. Because at this point, he was still putting on shows, and I also wanted to train to get back into shape. And he said, "Yeah, sure. Reach out to me when you get cured." So again, then I came back in 2014 because I was cured in December 2013. So I think around January 2014, February 2014, I started training with Jacques again, and he helped get me back in shape for my comeback when I came back as Hannibal the Death Dealer. But during that period of time, I did wrestle some matches for him under a mask as the Predator, and he made me wrestle under a mask because I was going to be wrestling for Great North Wrestling, and he didn't want. He had the rule you couldn't wrestle as in his company and other companies. So he figured if I'm wearing a mask, it it'll be different. But I guess some people complained that it wasn't fair that I was wrestling for other companies, even though I had a mask on in Jacques' company. So eventually he told me I had to either stop wrestling for other places, including for myself, or continue wrestling for him. And again, I didn't hold a grudge over it. I understood it. I was right about to wrestle AJ Styles at this point. Literally, my 4th match back from Hep C treatment was against AJ Styles. So it's not like I'm going to say no. I'm not going to wrestle AJ Styles. I'm going to continue to wrestle under a mask on events that, while they might be in front of 4 or 5 thousand fans, they're not videotaped, and I'm not going to get like any more known in wrestling from. So it was an easy choice, but I did have fun wrestling for him. He's a very nice guy. I have absolutely nothing bad to say about him. I'm still friends with him to this day. I think I've done maybe 5 interviews with him by this point. So nothing bad to say about him. True legend. He should be in the WWE Hall of Fame. Where I will say, I'll jump ahead in this story a bit because it just has. I don't want to talk about Kevin Owens again. Kevin Owens and Jacques had bad heat after they had their breakup, which I guess was sometime after I left because they were still on good terms when I was there, obviously. Uh, and I hadn't wrestled once when I returned to Calgary in 2003, January of 2003. I hadn't wrestled in the Montreal or Ottawa area because I hadn't come back to from Calgary for like 2 years. And I remember in January 2005, I got booked as an extra for WWE in Montreal and Ottawa, or sorry, Montreal and Toronto, which I'll get into those stories in more detail because there were some relevant things that happened in those extra jobs. I'll get into those more detail in those in later chapters or later parts because this is just a draft book. But because those events were in January and because I Christmas was going to take place, there was going to be about 2.5, 3 weeks that I managed to get the time off work, and I'm like, okay, I haven't seen my parents for almost 2 years or my grandmother, but I still kept in contact, talking to my grandmother all the time on the phone, and kept in contact with my parents. That I was going to go back for those tryouts, but come back for Christmas. And then I was going to try and get booked as much as I could as a wrestler in the Montreal area and Ottawa area in that time to just get more experience and kind of get my name out there. And it's funny because I had been a lower card guy in Stampede, but when I came back to Montreal, there was this guy. I think his name was Michael Ryan. He's dead now, but he was helping me get booked. I forget even how I got in contact with him, but he got me booked on about 6 or 7 shows in the 3 weeks that I was back in Montreal. Those shows included Paul and Carl Leduc's Fédération Lutte Québécoise, Dangerous Dan's promotion in the Hull, Quebec region, which I can't even remember what it was called, but it was, anyways, I had matches for them at the time. I had NCW matches, and then I was supposed to have a match for a company called Internet Wrestling Syndicate that Kevin Steen was in it at the time. And that was going to be the biggest. They were the most popular wrestling company in Montreal at that time. So I was really excited to wrestle on that show. So basically what happened was I did all the other shows. There was no issues, and I actually got a bit of a buzz about me from those matches because I guess people knew I was getting the WWE extra jobs, and I was doing like the Stampede wrestling style, which is a lot more realistic and different and more hard hitting than the Quebec wrestling style. So I actually really got over it in those matches, and particularly I had good matches with Carl Leduc, who had been in Stampede wrestling at a different time than me, and Carl ended up having Carl actually beat Bradshaw in the WWE in the very first match ever at Scotiabank Place or at Canadian Tire Center in Ottawa. But Carl and I had two really good matches, I think, or we were a tag team, then we broke up, had a fight, then we ended up having a match, and they were really good. But anyways, the whole point was a couple days before this I think it was called Internet Wrestling Syndicate show still at this time. A couple days before this match, this Michael Ryan guy messages me, who again, he was acting as like my booker at that time, hooking me up because he was just a nice guy. He wanted to help me out. He said, "Do you have heat with Kevin Steen?" And I said, "No, I've barely talked to him." Um, like literally, we had to pretty much, other than shaking hands and him showing a thing or two, like we had no heat. I was shy, and he didn't talk much in those days either. But he's like, "Oh, Kevin got you booked off this international or internet wrestling syndicate show." So again, I couldn't understand why, but that was the first I heard that Kevin had issues with me. I don't know if he was jealous that I was getting WWE tryouts at that time because he wasn't. Obviously, he ended up having the WWE career due to my Hep C positive test. As I'll get into in a later chapter, my contract got rescinded, but I ended up, even though I started after him, I got signed before him. He ended up making millions of dollars. I've made money as a wrestling reporter, barely got by as a wrestler at the times I'm wrestling full time. So congratulations to him. But throughout the years, as I was wrestling, when we were both wrestling in the Ottawa, Quebec area, I would always hear he was bashing me to people. Heard it from many, many, many people. So he always had an issue with me. And again, where it started from, I don't know. But after a while, I started to get offended that I kept hearing that he was dissing me everywhere. I never had any confrontation with him. I've never actually seen him in person since 2002 when we trained in Montreal. Never actually seen him in person. I know Jeremy Prophet who was a guy that wrestled a lot in Great North Wrestling for me and was also trained by Jacques. Had a problem with him and called Kevin out on it once, but Kevin backed down. Um, but anyways, I don't care anymore. I wish him the best. He's not my style of wrestler, but I wish him the best. But for people that are wondering where the heat came from, it came from him getting me unbooked from an event in Montreal for absolutely no good reason. So overall, the Jacques Rougeau experience was a good experience. I did save up enough money during that time. Oh, here's the other thing I'll mention before we shut down. I was working as a bouncer during that year at a bar called Maxwell's in Ottawa, which was actually I'll tell you some stories about this. There is an interesting thing. There was a guy there who was a football player that went to the same university as Stephanie McMahon named Steve Campagna. And I'm sorry if I don't remember his last name exactly. Really nice guy, Italian guy. He was the toughest of the bouncers at Maxwell's. He was like a good 10 years older than me. But he was actually having sex with Stephanie McMahon when he went to school at that university. And then here was the funny thing. She would actually come to Ottawa here and there. So it's funny that Ottawa is such a random city. Stephanie McMahon would come to Ottawa and party with him at various times. And he said Italians usually live with their parents for a long time. She would sleep on his mother's couch when she would come to visit, apparently. And up to that point in time, which was 2002, whenever WWE came to town, I mean, they stopped having their sexual relationship by this point. She was obviously with Triple H, but she would still get him tickets. And he did tell me that if I ever met Stephanie McMahon to ask her about him. And by this point, this was I'll talk more in detail about this tryout after. This was probably a dumb thing to do and may have led to me actually not getting signed on this particular trial. But I did actually get the chance to briefly talk to Stephanie at the SmackDown taping in Kelowna in 2004 when I was being used as an extra. And I brought up Steve's name. And like she seemed very awkward about it, maybe because Triple H was also there. He wasn't around when I asked, but I said, "Hey, I used to bounce with the guy that used to date you, Steve." And she actually did recognize And so yeah, he's a good guy. But yeah, it was kind of awkward that I brought it up, so maybe I should not have brought up that I knew him by that point. Again, that was like 2.5, 3 years after I knew him, and I wasn't even on Facebook at this time. It's just like I had been out of contact with him, so who knows if they had a falling out by this point. But like I felt like it was kind of awkward. During again, the girl that I was with at that time was the one that I had sex with first in my life. Again, it was long distance by this point. At some point during the summer, and I was completely faithful, even though I was working at a bar, getting hit on all the time, but I was still shy around girls. So I had been completely faithful. And at some point during the summer, she told me she had been cheating on me, which completely broke my heart. Eventually, and I even after she told me that, I mean, I was again, my parents were still strict when I was back living with them during this time. I was just bouncing. Um, so yeah, finally about in the fall, there was some actually stripper that started coming to Maxwell's and like was hitting on me regularly. I ended up starting to have sex with her. I was still somewhat in contact with my Calgary girlfriend, which she was not my girlfriend by this time. But I guess she got jealous when she started hearing that I was having sex with this other girl. So we agreed to get back together. But her cheating on me kind of broke. I was so faithful and like so in love with that girl, and I probably would have always been a faithful person if I hadn't had my heart broken like that when she cheated on me. It kind of ruined me from being faithful to some of my future girlfriends. That and looking up to Ric Flair as a hero. But the other reason I wanted to bring up the bouncing was I was so tired when I would do these Montreal Jacques Rougeau practices because I wouldn't get home from bouncing till like 3:30 in the morning, and the Jacques Rougeau practices were at like 8 in the morning in Montreal. So I would sleep like 1 hour. A lot of the times my dad would be kind enough to drive me. I would say 80% of the time my dad drove me to these Montreal practices because he didn't want me driving to Montreal and back on an hour or two sleep. So those I remember those were like kind of nice memories driving with my dad to Montreal. He was a great father, and he still is to this day. Very very supportive. And other than that, that's about all I could say. I remember it being a very good time. Pierre Carl Ouellet was very nice. I didn't learn much about calling wrestling on the fly. I learned about the entertainment aspect, and I was so honored. I was so honored and starstruck to train with Jacques. I was quite starstruck because I was always a fan of his. The very first wrestling event I ever went to, the Ottawa Civic Center in June 1989. The main event was technically Brutus Beefcake against Macho Man, but the last match of the show was the Rougeau brothers against the Rockers. For some reason, main events in those days usually went on halfway through the show before intermission, and then the Rougeaus often closed the shows. Just answer some of your comments. Steve, good morning to you. I was big in that picture. That picture was taken in 2014. Oh, the one other thing to that I'll remember from this picture is at the time I was training with Jacques in 2014, he did, I don't know if Vince even got the email, but he emailed Vince about possibly having me and his son Cedric, who was like 6'7", 300 pounds, be a tag team as like the new Quebecers with Jacques managing us. And he never heard back. Um, I'm just gonna say that would have been a great team because I'm a pretty good bumper and worker, and I could have done like most of Cedric could do like 360 splashes. He just wasn't he had only done like matches that had been planned out by that time, so he wasn't as seasoned. I could have done most of the work on that team. Cedric is like I became very good friends with Cedric around 2014. I remember going to restaurants with him and like all the girls would stare at him. He just has like at that point in time he was in great shape and he had like the classic good looks and like you knew he looked like a superstar. I still don't understand why WWE never signed Cedric. Jacques suspected that Kevin Owens screwed it, like talked bad about him, which I believe because Kevin's a very political guy. But Cedric was 6'7", 300 pounds. The women that loved him. He very athletic, and he carried the Rougeau name. So eventually, of course, they didn't take the new Quebecers idea, which again, that would have been great. With Jacques managing us, that would have been an amazing tag team. Um, it's too bad that never happened. But a couple of years later, Jacques did manage to get Cedric a tryout with WWE for NXT. And again, they sign people all the time with no experience that aren't the size of Cedric and don't have the most famous name in Quebec wrestling history. Uh, so apparently he did his NXT tryout for 3 days, and then he was told he needed to get more experience. It's like how it, how can you sign some people with no training at all, and then you have like the stereotypical perfect wrestling physique with a guy that like is attractive and charming to females, like a guy that's actually going to attract females to your product because he has those good looks. And then he carries a name where he could be a megastar in Quebec because they only go to Montreal and Quebec City. When the Rougeaus were in WWE, they would go to Trois-Rivières, Drummondville, Sherbrooke. They even went to Rimouski a few times. Like they would go to all the smaller Quebec towns too, and Quebec was a much hotter market for WWE. But for some reason, Cedric was told he needed to get more experience, and then he ended up quitting wrestling soon after. Jacques, by the way, one other thing, I did cover his retirement match, and I think it was in 2016. He had a retirement match teaming with his sons before 11,000 fans at Jerry Park in 2016. Now, Raw last week in Montreal had 11,000 fans. So keep in mind, Jacques Rougeau on an independent show that had pretty much all kids wrestling on the undercard had 11,000 fans for his retirement match. And here's a little thing that nobody knows because I never talked about it before. Uh, like in January or February, the year of his retirement match, he had called me and said he wanted me to be one of the opponents for his retirement match. And he said to mark the date on the calendar. But then I guess probably because people complained that I was wrestling other places, he ended up never calling me back to be one of those opponents in the retirement match. So I'm sad that I never got to be involved in his retirement match, but he did let me come and cover it. The retirement match is on the Hannibal TV, by the way. And I did an interview with him right after he retired in the dressing room. So in the end, it's probably better that I covered it and captured those moments. I also interviewed all of his kids right after the match, but I would have liked to have been in that retirement match for sure. Sean remembers him coming through Memphis back in the day. Yeah, he did wrestle in Memphis back in the day. AQ likes hearing my stories. Yeah. I'm not trying too hard to promote these book entries because, again, I'm doing it in hopes of actually someone's going to do an actual written book. And as I said, I'm going to get more and more busy as the months go on here, but I have the time to make these entries now. So My next entry, part 6, is gonna be my training in the dungeon and time in Stampede Wrestling. So thanks for tuning in.